Historiographical essay, Puritanism as a forerunner, an embodiment of radical Marxist ideology, the paradox of Christian religion as a force for both harmony and hierarchy, as well as radical leveling, has been a crucial component in driving philosophical and historiographical analysis. Karl Marx's statement, "Religion is the opiate of the masses," has played a profound role in shaping how radically inclined thinkers have understood religion. Read in a vacuum, this quotation can and has rationalized the marginalization and violent persecution of religious ideas and the faithful. Conversely, conservative forces have used Marx's opiate quotation to define religion as antithetical to his ideology, radicalism, and the left in general. However, one need only read the sentence before Marx's opiate descriptor to find that he also describes religion as the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. While Marx thought that religion would erode naturally as a future socialist society met human needs, and that a workers' party should demystify religious witchery, which perpetuated injustice and delusion, he took it for granted that everyone should be able to attend to his religious, as well as his bodily needs, without the police sticking their noses in. One need only to look to the New Testament's Book of Acts, or 35, chapter 36, to find the origin of Karl Marx's most famous maxim, "From each according to his ability, from each according to his need." Reading on to Acts 17:6, one finds a more radical prescription than even Marx's dialectic materialism, in which Paul and his followers challenged the first-century ruling establishment of Jewish religious leaders and Roman imperial culture by turning the world upside down. The radical dimensions of Christian theology, as well as the intertwining of radical Marxist and Christian identities, lay at the heart of much of the historiography of radical Puritanism. Was there such a phenomenon distinctly understood as Puritanism? To what did their ideas lead? How were these ideas articulated and chronicled? Historians concerned with the intellectual and social history of Puritanism grapple with these questions. This essay will examine the historiography of the leftist radical dimensions of Puritan thought and action. The theoretical framework for this historiography stems largely from the work and mentoring of Marxist historian Christopher Hill. Works such as G.E. Aylmer's Unbelief in 17th Century England, Christopher Hill's World Turned Upside Down, and the English Bible, George L. Moss's Puritan Radicalism and the Enlightenment, and Philip Gura's A Glimpse of Sion's Glory will be surveyed, along with other historiographically relevant works touching on the structural affinity between leftist radicalism and Puritanism. Religion is often spoken of as being emblematic of a nation's cultural consciousness. The Weberian view of capitalism as an outgrowth of Calvinist ideology has become a buttress for the trope of the United States' exceptional inoculation against radical socialist ideology. However, if religion is emblematic of cultural consciousness, what can the puritanical pillars of English and American culture tell us about their radical revolutionary episodes? Furthermore, what can the ideology of the historian tell us about how the past is interpreted or distorted? The understanding of Puritanism as an embodiment or preform of radical, mass-based, leftist ideology stems largely from the works of mid-20th century British Marxist-Leninist historian Christopher Hill. As a Marxist, Hill views history as a progressive dialectical process of historical stages governed by the historical law, or materialistic human tendency, of an economic base producing a cultural superstructure. This diachronic process ultimately culminates in the emancipation of the lowly and oppressed via revolutionary change, working-class hegemony, and the socialist mode of production. However, this process cannot move forward without human agency interacting with historical, economic, and socio-political circumstances beyond human control. This means that cultural products, such as religion, are comprised of a dialectic synthesis, reflecting the ruling elite's hegemony and the yearning for justice, freedom, and meaning of the oppressed. Furthermore, the varying elements of the socio-cultural dialectic, such as religion, will often be interpreted and articulated differently depending on whether the cultural text is being read by the ruling or oppressed class. For Hill, when Puritanism was in the hands of the 17th century English underclass, it acted as a theoretical tool to aid in their role in what Marxists understand to be the emancipatory historical mission of human liberation. Acting as a pre-modern ideological surrogate and for the scientific revolutionary ideology of Marx, Puritanism provided the English underclass with a language of rebellion, utopianism, and revolution. In terms of Hill's Soviet sympathies, the concept of a structural surrogate was also a critical component of the legitimacy of Leninist ideology. This was due to the fact that the Bolshevik Party waged a revolution in the name of the industrial proletariat in a largely agrarian Russia. Therefore, revolutionary surrogates, peasantry as proletariat, were needed to fill in the components of the Karl Marx's revolutionary rubric. However, this begs the question, how can Puritanism act as a rough structural surrogate to Marxism, Leninism, or leftist ideology in general? Historian Nicholas Thiacke, a former student of Hill's, describes Puritanism as an elastic term. Indeed, Puritanism can be described less as a monolithic ideology and more as a theological tendency that emphasizes the primacy of the Bible as God's word. According to this puritanical mode of thought, one must absorb biblical teaching personally, free from the distorting forces of paganism and political power, embodied most egregiously in the form of the Catholic Church. The concept of a personal interaction with the Bible opens up a wide range of interpretation, ranging from conservative to avant-garde readings of Scripture. What then of radical ideology? For Hill, radical ideology is at its best in the form of Marxism. The metaphysical fabric of Marxism is paradoxically historical materialism with an atheistic aesthetic. How then does Puritan theology act as a surrogate for an atheistic historical meta-narrative? In order to answer this question, one must understand how atheism was viewed in the 17th and 18th centuries. G.E. Aylmer, another disciple of Hill's, attempts to answer this question in his 1978 essay, Unbelief in 17th Century England. Aylmer begins by posing the question concerning 16th and 17th century England. Were there in fact any atheists, and how are we to set about establishing this? A significant difficulty in ascertaining the answer to this question stems from the fact that, unlike the 19th and 20th century, atheism was not viewed as a fashionable, logical, or life-affirming ideology in early modern Europe. Aylmer emphasizes that openly articulated rejection of God could theoretically result in the death penalty in 17th century England. In addition, atheism was not considered a normative, ontological possibility within the cultural vernacular of the 17th century. This line of thought led atheism, along with idolatry, heresy, and hypocrisy, to be viewed as a symptom of mental illness, stemming from indulgence in corrupt affection. Atheism was considered a taboo or pejorative regarding theological views and actions understood to refer to blasphemers, or a religious deviance. For that matter, Catholics and Protestants would apply the term to each other in order to exaggerate what they viewed as one another's heretical doctrines. In essence, no clear distinction existed between atheism and alleged heresy. This contributed to 17th and 18th century atheism being on the one hand ubiquitous and on the other ill-defined. To complicate matters further, quasi-materialist, non-Trinitarian variants of Christianity, such as Unitarianism, could be considered deist. Deism was considered indistinguishable from atheism in 17th century England. Thus, the lines between atheism, deism, and unorthodox Christianity are further blurred in 17th century English discourse. This line of logic was furthered by Calvinist author and Anglican apologist Henry Smith in his treatise God's Arrow Against the Atheists. Smith describes non-Anglican worldviews stemming from separatism, Anabaptism, Roman Catholicism, and non-believers to be categorically aligned with the Antichrist. However, Aylmer does find definitions of atheism among Anglican apologetic writing that merged with 19th and 20th century understandings of the term. For example, in Thomas Blount's defines atheism as the damnable doctrine and opinion of the atheists, infidelity, the denying of or not believing in God, and believes there is no God or rule of religion, and that the soul dies with the body. Ultimately, Aylmer concludes that while existential questions concerning God are timeless, the socio-cultural framework defining atheism between 16th, 17th, and 19th, 20th centuries differs too greatly to be able to find clear samples of principled atheists mirroring the Marxist-Leninist variety. Aylmer's mentor, Christopher Hill, began writing on the historical and political parallels between England and the Soviet Union during World War II when Hill was commissioned by the British government to use his academic prowess and affiliation with the English Communist Party to help build English sympathy for its wartime ally, the Soviet Union. Hill produced the booklet, Two Commonwealths, The Soviets and Ourselves in 1945. Looking back on the booklet, in a 1994 article entitled Don't Blame Lenin for Stalin, written for the newspaper The Independent, Hill stated that he had made a point of drawing parallels between the 17th century English Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789, and the Russian Revolution of 1917. In essence, Hill not only related England to the most famous European revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, but he went on to argue that it was the English Civil War which ultimately provided a structural pattern for the French and Russian revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the introduction to his 1993 monograph, The English Bible, Hill restates this point. Jacobins, Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks, regicide and republic, fitted into the pattern set by the English Revolution. After standing with the English Communist Party through Khrushchev's repudiation of Stalinism and the Soviet invasion of Hungary, Hill left the party in 1957 feeling that inter-party democracy had been intolerably diminished. His view of the English Civil War now took on a decidedly anti-Stalinist rhetoric. This is conveyed via the portrayal of Oliver Cromwell in Hill's 1958 monograph, Oliver Cromwell, in which Cromwell plays the role yet of a Stalin surrogate, who, after achieving power with aid of the lower classes, reveals himself to be a proto-bourgeois despot who cannibalizes his followers. Hill states, in his Cromwell's speeches to his first parliament, he equated poor men with bad men and said that if a commonwealth must suffer, it was better that it should suffer from the rich than from the poor. The levelers, egalitarian, mass-based Puritans, with whom he worked in 1647 and in the winter of 1648-9, and whose leaders he imprisoned and shot in the spring of 1649, had some reason to regard Cromwell as a double-crosser. Hill visits this theme again in the English Bible. French revolutionaries feared the advent of a Cromwell, and they got a Napoleon. Russian revolutionaries worried about Bonapartism, military dictatorship, and they did not notice Stalin creeping up from within. Hill's most well-known work concerning the radical currents of Puritan ideology is The World Turned Upside Down, 1972. In it, he argues that the revolutionary dynamics of the English Civil War created an environment in which the materialistic, utopian, humanist impulses of the lower classes could surface in the form of avant-garde Puritan theology. This provided a foundational glimpse of the materialistic radical proletariat who would ultimately win historical hegemony. For example, Hill describes the famless strain of Puritanism as an anti-clerical layman's creed. Led by Henry Nicolaes, they advocated a materialistic interpretation of the Bible. Familists were said to reject prayer and deny the resurrection of the body. They questioned whether any heaven or hell existed apart from this life. Other working-class surrogates, such as true levelers or diggers, envisioned an England that protected the poor from the rich, and in some instances advocated agrarian communist utopian theocracy. The constitutional levelers advocated reform through religious toleration, legal reform, free trade, and more democratic suffrage through constitutional reform. The true levelers represent Hill's radical Bolshevik surrogate, while the constitutional levelers represent the Menshevik surrogate, with Hill showing greater sympathy for the former. Playing the role of Marx or Lenin was radical leveler intellectual Gerard Winstanley, who sought to provide the masses with a materialist theological framework for Cromwellian order. Winstanley advocated collective ownership of land under the ideal of natural rights, and the brotherhood of humanity under God. This idealistic view was pragmatically balanced by his call for a socio-political order, approximating a Leninist conception of proletarian dictatorship via an army to restrict and destroy all who endeavor to keep up or bring kingly bondage again. According to Hill, Winstanley did not believe in a traditional metaphysical interpretation of the New Testament. Rather, reason and communist utopia in the present world were manifestations of God in the figurative second coming of Christ. Conversely, the evils that came with private property, covetousness, and pride were manifestations of the Antichrist. For Hill, Winstanley viewed the Bible figuratively and materialistically. He saw the struggle of good and evil being manifest in the dialectics of poor versus rich and communal property, which is private. Hill saw this perspective of Winstanley as a preform of Marxist philosophy, in which progress and paradise would ultimately come by the hand of human agency. The synthesis of human agent and external circumstances explored by Hill more fully in his 1993 work, The English Bible in the 17th Century. While The World Turned Upside Down focused on esoteric Puritan surrogates of Marxist-Leninist ascendancy, the English Bible is concerned primarily with the intertwining of biblical text, with class, and the shifting socio-political frameworks of 17th century England. Hill describes the Bible as a product of a series of historical compromises. This process was driven by class dynamics of the ancient Jewish people, a reflection of political and social tensions between prophets and kings, Old Testament, as well as radical dogmatic and cultural upheaval, New Testament. The various books of the Bible were a result of revisions by various generations, in addition to theological meditation, philosophy, and poetry. It is the culmination of a people's grappling with the dynamics of class, power, and truth through an intellectual and theological reconciliation with God in a millennial process. For Hill, before the advent of the philosophical and scientific humanism of the Enlightenment, the Bible was the source of all wisdom and truth for England. However, due to the synthetic, paradoxical, or contradictory, depending on one's perspective, nature of the biblical text, it could be used, according to Hill, to prove anything. This led to the Bibles having both radically destabilizing consequences, when in the hands of the masses, and binding hegemonic effects, when in the hands of the powerful. Hill substantiates this by referencing Henry VIII's forbidding of common women, artisans, laborers, and servants from independently reading the New Testament. Furthermore, Hill references the occurrence of the language of liberation being woven through the New Testament during times of political distress, as demonstrated in the example of Gerard Winstanley, as well as with Marx. The association of liberation with transcendent goodness can lead to the conceptualization of bondage with transcendent evil. This can lead to the labeling of individuals associated with the concept of bondage as transcendently evil, thus leading to their dehumanization and possible execution in the name of goodness triumphing over evil. This reasoning rationalizes Winstanley's justification of what later would become Leninist-style rule. However, Hill also notes the inverse language of Old Testament imperialism as a justification for European colonial expansion and the enslavement of native populations in the name of civility and principled hierarchy. Herein lies Hill's issue with the Bible as a historical agent. Its dialectical qualities, representing both oppressor and oppressed, can prove anything, which, for Hill, inversely means that it can prove nothing. Hill considers the less diffuse ideologies of the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment to be substantially more insightful than the Bible, and thus dethroning it as the driving force behind European socio-historical action. While this assessment is understandable due to Marxism's ideological affiliation with materialist humanism, it is also a structural and philosophical irony. Leninism itself embodies both the oppressor and the oppressed, since the party wields authoritarian power over the people it claims to represent. Finally, Philip Gura, a non-Marxist admirer of Hill's work on Puritan radicalism, selectively applied Hill's analytical lens to 17th century Puritan New England in his 19th monograph, A Glimpse of Scion's Glory. Gura, unlike Hill, does not utilize Marxist-Leninist surrogates or principled criticism of the Bible in his work. He does, however, utilize intellectual history to examine the diversity of religious thought that existed under the theological umbrella of Puritanism. Gura divides his work into two sections. Firstly, Gura analyzes the scope and content of Puritan ideologies in New England, ranging from materialistic ranters, pacifistic Quakers, and spiritist antinomians to the mainstream Puritan ideology of John Winthrop. Puritan sects gained sharper distinctions as various denominations sought to define themselves in terms of cultural and doctrinal differences with each other. In his second section, Gura analyzes the interactions and tensions between the Puritan denominations. Gura demonstrates how Puritanism's conservative mainstream overcame challenges from the more unorthodox theological periphery by co-opting the millennialist language of the Second Coming and increased toleration of dissenting opinions. These changes gave New England Puritan radicalism mass appeal. The intertwining of Puritan and Marxist thought and action can be found largely in their structural similarities. Both belief systems have historically sought to utilize the paradoxical concept of harmonious hierarchy in order to achieve human redemption and reconciliation to transcendent truth, for the Christian to God, for the Marxist to the laws of history. While historians like Hill may reify the past with their historiographical lens, they provide meaningful insight into humanity's transcendent yearning for justice, progress, and purpose. It is this type of yearning that gives meaningful significance to historiography and lived experience and bibliography. Acts 4:35-36, King James Bible, Aylmer, G.E. Unbelief in 17th century England, Puritans and Revolutionaries, Essays in 17th Century History presented to Christopher Hill. Oxford, London, 1978, Edward John, Christopher Hill, Some Reminiscences. Puritans and Revolutionaries, Essays in 17th Century History presented to Christopher Hill. Oxford, London, 1978. Gura, Philip, A Glimpse of Scion's Glory. Wesleyan University Press, Connecticut, 1984. Hill, Christopher. Oliver Cromwell, 1658 to 1958. Publisher, Routledge and Paul. London, 1903. Hill, Christopher. Second Thoughts, Don't Blame Lenin for Stalin. Christopher Hill looks back on his study of the Russian Revolution, The Independent. Hill, Christopher. The English Bible and the 17th Century Revolution. Penguin Books, London. 1993. Hill, Christopher. World Turned Upside Down. Radical Ideas During the English Revolution. Penguin Books, London, 1972. Marx, Karl. A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right Introduction. http://w.marxists.org. Archive Marx Works, 1843. Critique HPR Intro. H. Marx, Karl. Critique of the Gotha Program. Chapter 4. http://w.marxists.org. Archive Marx Works, 1875. Tiake, Nicholas. Science and Religion at Oxford Before the War. Puritans and Revolutionaries. Essays in 17th Century History presented to Christopher Hill. Oxford, London.